Hello, I'm Henry Mack, filling in for Helen Foray for this week's issues. On today's program, the first Republican primary debate took place Thursday night. How did the top 10 candidates fare? Our panel will then later discuss this later on. But first, as summer comes to a close, South Florida parents and students are preparing for the school year. In Miami-Dade County's public schools, there are some new programs and initiatives that will be implemented, including additional magnet programs, expanding STEM and technology programs, and eliminating out-of-school suspensions. Instead, looking for an alternative option to disciplining students. Joining me to discuss these changes, we welcome Miami-Dade County Public Schools Superintendent Alberto Carvalho. Thank you so much for being here. So we begin the fall semester and the upcoming school year. What do you want to highlight? What's exciting happening now in Miami-Dade County Public Schools?
Number one, thanks for the opportunity, Henry.
Absolutely.
Look, I think there are three main topics that I'd like to talk about. Number one, we just approved a $4.8 billion budget. We were able to reduce the tax rate, even though we passed a bond referendum back in 2012. And through good financial management, we've actually been able to reduce the tax rate, giving the taxpayers in Miami-Dade, on average, $46 tax reduction. Secondly, we are increasing programs, and you mentioned it. 53 new magnet choice programs, thematic instruction that makes it relevant and rigorous for students, anything from engineering, mathematics, robotics, coding, international baccalaureate, Cambridge programs. We are a one-size-fits-none program school system that offers kids choice.
On that point, certainly technology is sort of the way to go, especially because the direct correlation it has to jobs, potential jobs, at least for our students, right? What are you doing by way of sort of the humanities and sort of cultivating virtuous citizens, empathetic citizens, critically minded ones? Because the risk is that you sort of over-mechanize education and thus the students.
So,
you know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think sometimes when we overspeak STEM, we forget the liberal arts and the beauty of actually educating the whole child.
Yeah.
That's why probably half of the 53 new programs center on humanities, on languages, on different fields aside from STEM, and allow students to choose. Many focus on performing arts, music, dancing, ballet. There's something for every single student in Miami-Dade County Public Schools. That's why we make this significant investment in choice. Mm-hmm. We are a portfolio district allowing parents and students to drive their own educational journeys. Equally important is the fact that we're launching a number of new initiatives. I mean, we're hiring counselors for the first time in a post-recession era, 60 new counselors to tackle new ways of dealing with discipline that actually address the root cause of students.
Talking about educating the whole child, that's like sort of a catchphrase in education, one which cannot be ignored, both in the classroom by way of what's taught, but also now with respect to sort of disciplining. What are you doing to sort of help build character, help transform character by way of disciplinary action?
Well, Henry, values matter. And unfortunately, for a long time, we've focused on the academic adequacy of the child, forgetting the personal and civic adequacies that must be taught to kids, teaching them values. We do very well in teaching the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic. We forgot to teach respect, responsibility, and restraint. And we're getting back to those basics.
So how are you teaching that?
Well, number one, embedding as part of the curriculum, speaking about compassion and respect, teaching students the very first week of school how to get along with the others, how to recognize bullying, how to develop compassion, understanding as basic humanities.
The teachers doing this,
teachers,
or the
counselors, principals, videotape messages that are recorded, social media interaction with students. There are different ways of actually addressing this issue via important and connecting messages to kids.
So can you talk about eliminating out-of-school suspensions and
Absolutely.
what you just sort of forged?
At the national level, there's a crisis. 3 million students are suspended out of school every single year. That's enough to fill 45 Super Bowl stadiums. The economic, social, and educational loss to these kids, and basically transferring an educational problem to the judicial system very, very quickly, is of immense cost to our nation. So we've decided after a number of months in research that now is the time to absolutely decommission traditional outdoor suspension and create success centers that address the whole child. Try to understand via the work of social workers, school psychologists, and counselors, digital content, different approaches in different environments, connect with the child, address the root cause of the problem, connecting these students to social services rather than simply punishing them for their behavior. This is about doing far better than simply addressing the consequences. It's about being preventative in the educational approach.
Sure. How are you paying for these success centers?
Well,
this is part of the budget?
Correct. So we've done very good financial management over the past 7 years. We are finally out of the recession. We are investing $4 million into new counselors, $4 million into new bilingual programs. We are increasing funding in safety and security, but we have prioritized social services and the human effective investment that actually builds the quality of life and builds humanity in kids' lives.
Yeah, I like that phrase, the human effective investment. I mean, as I began sort of our conversation with the overemphasis on STEM, however great STEM programs are, we forget sort of, I think, of the human component here at work, especially with children, right? And I think eliminating out-of-school suspensions is an amazing initiative. Can you speak to as well the potential money you may receive from the state as a result of implementing uniforms across the board?
That was the easiest policy lift I've done in a long time. You know, the state appropriated about $10 million that would be allocated to districts that prior to September 1st adopt a district-wide uniform policy.
Right.
At the K-8 centers. It was very easy for us because all of our K-8 schools...
Only through K-8.
Correct.
Okay.
They already have a school site uniform policy. So it's very easy to lift the school site uniform policies and create the district-wide policy enabling us to be eligible for this $10 million allocation statewide. That could translate minimally to about $2.5 million. That would obviously be invested in providing uniforms and supplies to some of our neediest kids in Miami-Dade. And look, we are a wonderful community where there's quite a bit of wealth, but there's also disparity. And
Sure.
there are 6,000 school-aged kids right now who are homeless in Miami-Dade, 300 of whom live permanently in shelters. We're going to start with them. We're going to move on to kids who are in the foster care system and any needy family in Miami-Dade.
What initiatives do you have going that are going to help sort of cultivate that contingency, the homeless?
Number
what are
one,
you doing?
Terrific partnership with Chapman Partnership. We provide educational programs before school, during school, and after school that address both the educational needs as well as the social needs of these very fragile students. Secondly, we often collaborate with the parents, a number of social agencies like Lotus House. So we have our own homeless educational program that identifies early on the students, identifies their academic needs, and provides a fix and a fill for the gaps that they experience.
Sure. Back to the uniform issue, if I may, for a second. What do uniforms do for the psyche of students? Like, why impose uniforms? And especially those that are financially sort of struggling. I know you mentioned perhaps a portion of the $2.5 million will go to help underwrite the purchasing of uniforms for them, but what about people who can't pay for it? I mean, apart from...
So number one, we don't impose uniforms. The uniform policies are adopted at each school based on
it's an independent
universal vote of parents and the faculty, the teachers. So parents and teachers vote to bring about the uniform policy. And look, some of the benefits, and these are well tested through peer-reviewed research, are compelling. Number one, it eliminates the competition in terms of what you wear to school. The haves versus the have-nots, you cannot differentiate. Secondly, it builds a more safe and secure environment. It's easier to spot an intruder because they're usually not wearing a uniform. Thirdly, for students who skip school, it is easy to identify them on the streets because they're wearing school uniforms. So there are a number of very specific benefits that empower both parents and kids alike.
Yeah, really well said. One other concern was the overcrowding of elective classes in Miami-Dade Public Schools. What are we doing to address the overcrowding of students in these classes? There's no cap on these elective classes, only on the core classes, right? So how are we helping teachers?
That's correct.
there?
I mean, when Tallahassee passed class size reduction legislation, it imposed it only on the core subject areas. Interestingly, the ones that are tested. And that, I think that it is wrong. It is a wrong approach because it assigns a different weight to those subject areas that are tested versus those that actually are relevant and enticing to students that often bring kids to school. You know, the languages, the music, physical education.
To say nothing of the human factor involved in those classes, right?
So for us, it's got to be a balance. So we try to strike a balance between the class size reduction caps and, of course, subject areas by still offering a very robust elective program. Look, in Miami-Dade, we outspend the state 5 times in terms of foreign languages. So Spanish, the teaching of French, German, Portuguese, critically important. Secondly, arts and music programs. Every elementary school, every middle school, as opposed to other districts in the state that have basically abandoned those programs to comply strictly with class size reduction. Our budget reflects our values. So this year, the $4.2 million investment in bilingual programs is actually to expand the repertoire of elective classes for our students. Not only are they good for them, they entice and enhance critical thinking, but they're actually good for an economy that requires bilingual and biliterate citizens.
Sure. In light of the GOP debate and sort of the politics nationally, what are you hoping for from the federal government by way of education reform?
You know, certainly in terms of education reform, I'm hoping a federal government policy that strikes a balance between that which should be universally good for the country. So upholding minimum standards that enable America to compete with its international counterparts, balancing that out against the states' rights to in fact adopt and implement curriculum. So we should not necessarily follow a tight-lid type of conformist curriculum that all states teach the same thing at the same time. There ought to be some degree of flexibility.
Sure. Diplomatically and politically well put. How that looks like on the political spectrum, or like at least what policies sort of follow from that, remains to be seen. But thank you so much for joining me, Superintendent. It was a great pleasure. Alberto Carvalho, thank you so much for being here. So we begin the fall semester and the upcoming school year. Sort of, what do you want to highlight? What's exciting happening now in Miami-Dade County Public Schools?
Number one, thanks for the opportunity, Henry.
First, as summer comes to a close, South Florida parents and students are preparing for the school year. In Miami-Dade County's public schools, there are some new programs and initiatives that will be implemented, including additional magnet programs, expanding STEM and technology.
Look, I think there are three main topics that I'd like to talk about. Number one, we just approved a $4.8 billion budget. We were able to reduce the tax rate, even though we passed a bond referendum back in 2012, and through good financial management.
Hello, I'm Henry Mack, filling in for Helen Ferre for this week's issues. On today's program, the first Republican primary debate took place Thursday night. How did the top 10 candidates fare? Our panel will then later discuss this later on. But first, technology programs and eliminating out-of-school suspensions. Instead, looking for an alternative option to disciplining students. Joining me to discuss these changes, we welcome Miami-Dade County Public Schools Superintendent